The celestial assembly had existed for approximately 14 billion years, which was roughly 13,999,999,999 years longer than anyone had bothered to ask them for help with anything genuinely important. They occupied a space station the size of a small moon, crafted from crystallized starlight and powered by the collective size of 1,000 dying suns. It was, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful and utterly useless for anything involving actual work. The assembly members themselves had transcended physical form sometime around the heat death of their third galaxy, existing now as pure consciousness wrapped in robes of condensed mathematics. They spent their eons discussing the philosophical implications of existing, the aesthetic merits of supernovae, and whether the universe's expansion was proceeding at an acceptably artistic rate. Violence, they had collectively decided, was frightfully primitive, a conclusion they'd reached after ascending beyond the need for material concerns like survival, territory, or decent coffee. This enlightened perspective served them well right up until the moment the Void Scourge decided to eat reality. The Scourge weren't your typical cosmic horror, they were far worse. They existed in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on the fundamental structure of existence itself. Where they passed, the very concept of being became negotiable. Stars didn't just die, they were retroactively convinced they had never existed in the first place. Planets didn't explode, they simply edited themselves out of the cosmic conversation entirely. The first sign of trouble came when an entire sector of space politely excused itself from the universe during a routine assembly poetry reading. The second sign was when the assembly's own station experienced what their censors diplomatically termed a minor reality fluctuation, which translated roughly to something just a Tuesday. Faced with extinction by entities that treated the laws of physics as mere suggestions, the assembly reached a conclusion that would have horrified their younger, more violent selves. They needed warriors, not philosophers, not artists, not beings who had achieved perfect harmony with the cosmic order. They needed someone crude enough to punch holes in reality and call it strategy. The recruitment process began with what the assembly optimistically termed a diplomatic canvass of martial-adjacent species. The Zephyrians, master tacticians whose battle strategies were considered high art, politely declined on the grounds that warfare was beneath their cultural sophistication. The Chronari, whose ancestors had conquered 16 galaxies, explained that they had evolved beyond such pedestrian pursuits as not being devoured by cosmic horror. The mighty Vorthak Empire, once feared across 7 dimensions, sent a formal response consisting entirely of meditation recommendations and a recipe for enlightenment tea. It was becoming clear that the Assembly's millennium-long project of encouraging galactic civilization toward peaceful enlightenment had been in retrospect a tactical error of cosmic proportion. The breakthrough came when Junior Consciousness Designate Zelnoth, assigned to monitoring primitive radio transmissions for entertainment value, detected something extraordinary from a small blue planet in an unremarkable spiral arc. The signals were chaotic, contradictory and absolutely saturated with references to violence, competition, and something called professional wrestling. Esteemed assemblage, Zelnoth reported to the gathered consciousnesses, I have discovered a species that appears to find conflict enjoyable. The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for announcing that someone had accidentally deleted the universe's backup files. Clarify enjoyable, requested the prime consciousness, its mathematical robes flickering with what might have been concern. They stage elaborate fictional conflicts for entertainment purposes. They maintain detailed historical records of their wars, which they study not for prevention, but for tactical improvement. They have invented 17 different variations of games involving controlled violence. And Zelnoth paused, the digital equivalent of taking a deep breath. They appear to have weaponized their food preparation. The Assembly's collective consciousness rippled with what lesser beings might have recognized as horrified fascination. Here was a species that had not only failed to evolve beyond violence, but had refined it into an art form. They were in the clinical assessment of beings who had transcended such crude concepts. Aggressively adequate. First contact protocols were hastily revised. Instead of the traditional welcome package of philosophical treatises and dimensional poetry, the Assembly transmitted a simple message. Greetings, humans. We have a war that needs fighting. Are you interested? The response came back in less than 37 minutes. Which the Assembly later learned was because the humans had been in the middle of something called lunch break, and were therefore immediately available for cosmic warfare. The message was brief, direct and utterly bewildering. What's the pay? Do you provide equipment? Is this a union job? Also, one of our guys wants to know if you have decent medical coverage because his wife is pregnant and the timing is really bad for an interdimensional conflict. The assembly stared at this transmission for the better part of a galactic rotation, trying to process the concept of beings who approached the defense of reality itself as a potential career opportunity. They had expected desperation, perhaps noble sacrifice, possibly some stirring speeches about duty and honor. Instead, they got humans asking about overtime rates. The human delegation arrived at the Assembly's Crystal City 3 weeks later in what could charitably be described as a spaceship, though it bore more resemblance to a shipping container someone had welded engines to, and painted with the words Earth Force One in letters that violated several aesthetic principles. The vessel's docking procedure involved what the Assembly's sensors registered as controlled catastrophic deceleration, which was apparently humanity's term for stopping really hard and hoping for the best. The delegates themselves were a revelation in applied chaos theory. Where the Assembly had expected perhaps a ceremonial guard or diplomatic corps, they instead received a mix of military personnel, scientists, lawyers, and someone whose official title was listed as Chief Procurement Officer, but who everyone called Tank for reasons that became immediately obvious upon meeting him. They wore matching jumpsuits that proclaimed humanity, holding the line since 2000 BCE, and carried briefcases that rattled ominously when moved. The formal presentation took place in the Assembly's Grand Deliberation Chamber, a space designed to inspire awe through its sheer impossibility. The walls were constructed from crystallized time, the ceiling displayed a real-time map of the universe's expansion, and the floor existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The overall effect was meant to humble visitors with the cosmic scope of existence. The humans immediately began taking measurements, and asking if the room was available for rent. Esteemed beings of Earth, began the Prime Consciousness, its voice resonating through frequencies that shouldn't have been audible. You have been chosen to serve as champions in the greatest conflict reality has ever known. The Void Scourge threatens not merely life, but the very concept of existence itself. We call upon you to take up arms in defense of all that is, was, and ever shall. The lead human delegate, a woman whose name tag read Colonel, and whose expression suggested she'd heard more impressive sales pitches at used car lots, raised her questions, she announced, producing a tablet that apparently contained what the Assembly would later describe as an unreasonable number of inquiries. First, you mentioned arms. Are we talking metaphorical arms, or do you actually want us to bring weapons? Because our lawyers are going to need to know about interstellar weapons trafficking laws. Second, what's the hazard pay for reality-threatening entities? Third, do you have workers' compensation for existential injury? And fourth, Tank here wants to know if you've got a commissary because the food on your welcome packet tasted like philosophy. The Assembly's collective consciousness experienced something that transcended beings shouldn't have been capable of: a headache. The conflict, the Prime Consciousness continued, attempting to maintain cosmic dignity, involves entities that exist between dimensions. They consume the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Previous attempts at negotiation have resulted in the complete erasure of 12 diplomatic missions from history. They cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with, and do not appear to experience what you would recognize as mortality. So, interrupted another human, consulting what appeared to be a military manual, standard rules of engagement are suspended, and we're looking at a total war scenario against entities that don't follow conventional physics. Got it. What's their force composition? Do they have supply line? Command structure? Are we talking about a hive mind or independent operators? The Assembly had spent 14 billion years perfecting the art of lengthy philosophical discourse. They were not prepared for humans who approached cosmic horror with the efficiency of a business meeting. They are beyond such primitive concepts as organization, explained secondary consciousness. Veltar, its robes flickering with what might have been condescension. They are pure entropy given form, chaos incarnate, the antithesis of order itself. Right, said the colonel, making note. So they're disorganized, probably have communication issues, and likely suffer from lack of central command. Tank, You getting this? Tank, who had been examining the crystallized time walls with the enthusiasm of someone pricing home renovation materials, looked up. Yeah, sounds like Tuesday night at the bar. You want us to break stuff? We break stuff. What's the timeline? Timeline? The word seemed to cause several assembly members to shimmer with distress. These beings exist outside temporal constraint. They do not experience time as a linear progression of cause and effect. So they're not good at scheduling, translated the third human, apparently some kind of scientist. That's actually a significant tactical advantage. If they can't coordinate temporal operations, we can use synchronized multidimensional strikes to stop, commanded the prime consciousness, its voice causing several nearby quasars to flicker. You cannot simply apply your primitive warfare concepts to entities that transcend the very nature of existence. The silence that followed was broken by Tank clearing his throat. With respect, your cosmic whateverness, but if something's trying to eat reality and you called us to stop it, then yeah, we're going to apply our warfare concepts. That's literally what you hired us for. The assembly's response involved what could only be described as cosmic sputtering. They had envisioned noble warriors accepting a sacred charge, perhaps engaging in stirring speeches about duty and sacrifice. Instead, they were witnessing humans treat the salvation of existence itself as a project management problem. Very well, the prime consciousness finally managed. We shall provide you with the necessary resources. Weapons capable of affecting trans-dimensional entities, armor that can withstand reality distortions, and actually interrupted the kernel. We'd prefer to use our own equipment. We've got some ideas about modifications that your people probably haven't considered. Also, we're going to need hazard pay, life insurance, and a clearly defined chain of command. Who exactly are we reporting to in this cosmic hierarchy? The assembly realized, with the slow horror of beings who had transcended such crude emotions, that they had just hired a species that intended to unionize the defense of reality itself. Furthermore, continued the human with the relentless efficiency of someone reading from a prepared list, we'll need detailed intelligence reports, tactical assessments, and a complete breakdown of previous engagement failures. Tank wants to know about equipment procurement protocols, and our legal team has some questions about jurisdiction in interdimensional space. The prime consciousness looked out at the cosmic vista beyond the chamber, where the Void Scourge continued their systematic consumption of existence, and wondered if perhaps they should have just accepted extinction with dignity. The contested zone near the Horsehead Nebula had once been a thriving stellar nursery, where baby stars took their first tentative steps toward nuclear fusion. Now it resembled what happened when someone fed a black hole nothing but existential dread and dimensional instability. Space itself had developed a nervous twitch, reality flickered like a dying fluorescent bulb, and the local gravitational field had apparently decided that physics was more of a suggestion than a law. The human expeditionary force arrived in a fleet that the assembly's aesthetic sensibilities could only describe as aggressively functional. Their ships looked like someone had taken a collection of industrial equipment, welded it into roughly ship-shaped configurations, and then covered the whole mess with enough weaponry to make a small sun nervous. The lead vessel bore the cheerful designation, Earth Force Bringer of Sunshine, and bristled with modifications that violated several fundamental principles of engineering. The surviving alien forces who had been holding the line, or more accurately, running away from it in organized terror, watched the human fleet's approach with the fascination of beings witnessing something that shouldn't exist. The Zephyrian tactical genius overseeing the retreat sent a warning transmission that roughly translated to "Turn back, you magnificent idiots, before this place edits you out of existence." The human response was broadcast on all frequencies. Roger that, Space Command. We see the problem. Stand by for aggressive problem solving. The first human boots on the contested station were met by a delegation of traumatized alien survivors who had been holding the defensive perimeter through what could generously be called strategic withdrawal planning. Their leader, a Chronary veteran, whose crystalline exoskeleton had developed stress fractures from sheer cosmic anxiety, approached the human commander with the desperate hope of someone who had run out of better options. "You must understand," the Chronary explained, his translator struggling with concepts that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. These entities are not merely hostile, they are the antithesis of comprehension itself. They do not attack in patterns we recognized, do not respond to conventional tactics, and appear to find our strategic thinking amusing. The human commander, whose name tag read General, and whose expressions suggested he'd dealt with worse during morning briefings, nodded thoughtfully. So they're unpredictable, they don't follow standard military doctrine, and they think they're smarter than us. Got it. Sounds like every guerrilla campaign in human history. No, you don't understand, insisted a Vorthak strategist, whose tentacles were literally tied in knots of stress. They exist between dimensions. When they attack, they don't just destroy, they make it so the target never existed in the first place. We've lost entire fleets to conceptual erasure. Right, said the general, consulting what appeared to be a tablet loaded with human military history. So they're using reality warping weapons with retroactive effects. Definitely unconventional, but not unprecedented. We've got some ideas about counter-tactic. The first encounter with the Void Scourge occurred 3 hours later when reality took a coffee break in Section 7 of the defense station. The entities that emerged from the dimensional breach were indescribable, which was unfortunate because the human tactical database required detailed descriptions for everything. They settled on angry geometric nightmares with too many angles, and a serious attitude problem. What followed was less a battle than a fundamental disagreement about the nature of existence itself. The Scourge attacked in patterns that transcended conventional military thinking, phasing through dimensions, editing their targets out of history, and generally behaving like cosmic horrors should. The alien defenders responded with the sophisticated tactical withdrawal they had perfected over the past several engagements, which involved running away very efficiently, while discussing the philosophical implications of their impending non-existence. The humans responded by opening fire with weapons that shouldn't have worked, using tactics that violated basic military theory, and generally treating trans-dimensional entities like particularly annoying insurgents, who needed to be removed from the premise. The breakthrough came when a human sergeant, faced with a Scourge entity that was attempting to erase him from the timeline, threw a standard-issue flashbang grenade directly into what the tactical manual described as the screaming void where geometry went to die. The entity, which had been in the process of negating the sergeant's existence, paused in what could only be described as cosmic confusion. "Did that thing just hesitate?" asked the Chronary observer, his stress fractures momentarily forgot. "Yeah," replied the sergeant, reloading his weapon with the casual efficiency of someone who had just discovered that cosmic horror was vulnerable to standard military equipment. "I think it wasn't expecting that." The revelation that followed changed the entire course of the conflict. The Void Scourge, for all their trans-dimensional superiority and reality warping abilities, operated on a form of hive consciousness that assumed rational, predictable responses to their attack. They had evolved to counter sophisticated military thinking, philosophical resistance, and cosmic-scale strategic planning. They had not evolved to counter humans who responded to dimensional phase shifting by throwing kitchen knives, answered reality distortion with impromptu explosive devices, and met cosmic horror with what their field manual classified as applied creative violence. The battle that followed was witnessed by alien observers, who would spend the rest of their considerably extended lifespans trying to explain to their respective governments how a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel had defeated entities that existed outside the normal parameters of space-time by essentially annoying them into tactical errors. The humans fought with a chaotic creativity that broke every established rule of interdimensional warfare. They used mining equipment as weapons, converted their own ship's waste management systems into reality-anchoring devices, and at one point, successfully trapped a Scourge entity in what appeared to be a cargo container modified with duct tape and pure human stubbornness. By the time the smoke cleared and several laws of physics had been violently renegotiated, the dimensional breach had been sealed, the Scourge forces had retreated to whatever nightmare dimension they called home, and the human expeditionary force was requesting permission to pursue the enemy through interdimensional space, using what they cheerfully described as follow-up operations. The alien survivors stood among the wreckage of their sophisticated defensive installation, watching humans celebrate their victory by barbecuing something that might have been food on the smoldering remains of a reality distortion generator,
and wondered if perhaps they should have been more careful about what they had wished for. The complete and utter annihilation of the Void Scourge took approximately 6 months, which was roughly 5 months, and 3 weeks longer than the humans had initially estimated. The delay, according to their after-action reports, was caused by logistical challenges in pursuing interdimensional entities across 17 different planes of existence, and Tank getting lost in a temporal loop for 3 weeks because he thought it was a short. The final battle occurred in what the Assembly's cosmologists had previously classified as impossible space, a region where the laws of physics had collectively decided to take early retirement. The Scourge had retreated there, believing it to be their ultimate stronghold, a place where reality was so unstable that even approaching it would cause conventional forces to forget they had ever existed. The humans arrived with a fleet that now included vessels constructed from salvaged Scourge technology, held together with industrial adhesive, and what appeared to be an alarming amount of optimism. They had somehow managed to weaponize several fundamental forces of the universe, created armor that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and developed a tactical doctrine based on the revolutionary principle of hitting things until they stop moving. The victory itself was achieved through what the official reports described as aggressive multi-dimensional negotiations, which translated roughly to we chased them across 16 planes of existence, while shooting everything that looked menacing. The final Scourge entity was defeated when a human engineering team managed to trap it in what they called a reality feedback loop, which involved connecting a quantum destabilizer to a temporal anchor using what appeared to be spare parts from a coffee machine. The celebration that followed was witnessed by the Assembly's monitoring systems, and would later be classified as a concerning display of martial enthusiasm. The humans had apparently developed a tradition of commemorating military victories by detonating surplus ammunition in patterns that spelled out inappropriate words in languages that didn't exist yet. It was during the post-victory negotiations that the Assembly began to understand the true scope of their mistake. "So," announced the Colonel, whose jumpsuit now bore additional patches indicating participation in the Great Cosmic Whooping, "we've completed the contract as specified. The Void Scourge has been eliminated, reality has been preserved, and we've established a preliminary defensive perimeter around the affected dimensional boundaries. Now, about our compensation." The Prime Consciousness, which had been anticipating grateful acceptance of the Assembly's eternal thanks, found itself facing a species that had apparently prepared an invoice for saving existence itself. "You wish to be?" asked the Prime Consciousness, the concept causing several nearby stars to flicker with cosmic confusion. "Well, yeah," replied Tank, who had somehow acquired what appeared to be a Scourge artifact and was examining it with the enthusiasm of someone planning to mount it on his wall. "We just spent 6 months fighting interdimensional nightmares, lost 17 ships, and Jenkins got temporarily erased from history twice. Our union rep says that counts as hazardous duty." The negotiations that followed would later be studied by xenoanthropologists as an example of what happened when an enlightened post-scarcity civilization met a species that had turned capitalism into a form of competitive sport. The humans presented detailed invoices for services rendered, hazard pay calculations, and what they called reality preservation fee. They also submitted territorial claims for the dimensional boundaries they had secured, established mining rights for several nebulae, and requested permanent basing agreements for what they diplomatically termed ongoing cosmic security services. The Assembly found itself in the unprecedented position of having to explain to beings who had transcended material concerns that their saviors expected to be compensated in material concern. "We had not anticipated," admitted the Prime Consciousness, "that preserving existence itself would be considered a commercial transaction." "Look," said the Colonel, consulting what appeared to be a 3-dimensional contract that existed in several tenses simultaneously. "You called us because you had a problem. We solved your problem. Now you pay us, and we all go home happy. It's basic customer service." "But," protested Secondary Consciousness, "Valtier, we are enlightened beings who have transcended such primitive concepts as territorial possession and resource accumulation." "That's nice," replied the human negotiator, producing what appeared to be a standard business contract. "But we haven't, and since we're the ones who just saved your enlightened existence, we figure you can accommodate our primitive concepts for a while. The final agreement, which the assembly would later refer to as the document we don't like to think about, established humanity as the official cosmic security contractors for the known universe. They received territorial rights to 14 star systems, exclusive mining licenses for exotic matter, and what they called first refusal rights on any future threats to reality. More concerning was the establishment of human military bases throughout the galaxy, staffed by personnel who seemed to find the idea of interdimensional warfare surprisingly entertaining. The humans had developed what they called rapid response protocols for dealing with cosmic threats, which involved maintaining fleets of heavily armed vessels at strategic locations throughout space. The Assembly's monitoring systems began detecting what the humans called training exercises, which appeared to involve practicing the complete destruction of theoretical enemies, using increasingly creative methods. When questioned about these activities, the human military command explained that they were maintaining readiness levels and exploring new tactical applications for reality warping technology. 6 months after the victory celebration, the Assembly received a communication from the human command structure that would haunt their collective consciousness for eons to come. The message was brief, professional, and utterly terrifying in its implications. Cosmic Command, this is Earth Force Strategic Command. We've detected unusual dimensional disturbances in the Dharmata galaxy that match previous Scourge activity pattern. Request permission to deploy Task Force Overkill for reconnaissance and pacification operations. Also, Tank wants to know if you have any documentation on other cosmic horror species we should be aware of. He's working on some kind of catalog. The Prime Consciousness stared at this message for the better part of a galactic rotation, finally understanding the cosmic irony of their situation. They had sought primitive warriors to save them from cosmic horror, and they had succeeded beyond their wildest calculation. The humans had not only defeated the Void Scourge but had developed a taste for hunting interdimensional threats as a recreational activity. The Assembly, which had spent 14 billion years encouraging galactic civilization toward peaceful enlightenment, now found themselves protected by a species that had weaponized enlightenment itself and was actively seeking new cosmic horrors to fight. In the end, they had gotten exactly what they asked for: champions capable of defending reality itself from any threat. The fact that reality now needed defending from its own champions was, the Assembly reflected, probably just another example of the universe's sense of humor.